Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. This is Dr. Muhammad Shafiq, lecturer of philosophy at Department of Islamic and Pakistan Studies, CUST. The course I'm teaching you in this semester is called Kalam and Philosophy of Islam, and the course code is ISL 471. This lecture is about empiricism, and we are going to discuss what empiricism is, how did it start, and what impact it has on philosophy in general and in epistemology in particular. So let's move on and see what is the outline of today's lecture. The outline for today's lecture is, or the points we are going to discuss in this lecture today, are what empiricism is, or what do we mean by empiricism, what is the etymology of empiricism, and what is the history of empiricism, how did it begin, and what was the historical development of this school of thought. And then we'll move to British empiricism, which is one of the most prominent group of people in the history of epistemology in context of empiricism. And then we'll try to look into 20th century empiricism. So this is the outline for today's lecture. And now we move on to the next slide, which is about what is empiricism. Basically, empiricism is a theory in epistemology which explains, or which tries to explain, the source of knowledge. And as you know, the epistemology is concerned with the source of knowledge. We try to look into what are the sources of knowledge in order to look into the reality of knowledge, in order to see what valid knowledge means, and also what is the employability of this knowledge. So this theory, which is called empiricism, is a theory which says that all knowledge comes from sense experience. Empiricism is a theory which states that knowledge comes only or primarily from sensory experience. The study of human knowledge, along with other schools of thought in epistemology, empiricism basically emphasizes the role of experience and evidence, especially that of sense experience, in the formation of ideas over the notion of innate ideas or traditions. Empiricists argue that the traditions arise due to relations of previous sensory experience. So basically, empiricism holds that these are basically our sense experiences which form ideas in our mind. It's not the ideas which are innate in our mind. So they discount the concept of innate ideas, that there are ideas which are innate to our mind, which are always there in our mind. So these ideas basically are produced by the sense experience. So whenever we have certain experiences, these experiences basically form the ideas in our mind. So it's not that ideas, according to empiricists, ideas are already there in our mind. It is not as such. Basically, these ideas are the product of our sense experiences. So, in a nutshell, empiricism is the theory that says the origins of all knowledge is sense experience. So, we have our senses through which we can gain the knowledge. It emphasizes the role of experience and evidence, especially sense perception, in the formation of our ideas, and argues that the only knowledge humans can have is a posteriori knowledge, which means it is based on our experiences. Most of the empiricists also discount the notion of that innate ideas, that there are innate ideas lying in our mind. They deny it basically, and they basically hold that our mind is a blank slate, and through these sense experiences we get all the prints of the knowledge on our mind, and that is how our ideas are formed. So it's not like the ideas are there already. It's basically the experiences which form these ideas. Now let's move on to the next slide and try to look into the meaning of empiricism. Basically, the term empiricism is derived from obviously a Greek word empiric, and empiric basically refers to a physician whose expertise is based on experience rather than theory or instruction. So it's not like uh, there is already a theory, or uh, there is some sort of manual or instruction book which basically gives ideas to physician. Rather than, it holds that a physician, an empiric is such a physician who has expertise, who has uh, vast experiences, and has formed certain kind of ideas or expertise to treat people. So empiric basically means experience through sense perception. It is also derived from the Latin word experientia, the term experience, uh, which refers to obviously sense experience. So, as we know that we have got these five senses, we, we are blessed with these five senses: sense of taste, hearing, uh, touching, seeing, and smelling. These five. So all the knowledge basically is reducible to the data we have gained through these five senses. Someone might uh, say that, well, there are certain ideas which we have, uh, and we do not have any sense experience of that. For example, the idea of unicorn, or for example, the idea of golden mountain. So these kind of things do not exist, and we do not have experience of these. So how do we form these ideas? Uh, the empiricists basically would respond to this kind of query as that although we do not have experience of golden mountain, but obviously we have experience of gold, and we have experience of a mountain. So these two experiences are combined together and in our mind, and then it produces this idea. So the foundation for the idea of golden mountain is basically provided by our sense experience. So all our knowledge is founded or based upon our sense experience according to empiricism. Now, we move on to the history of empiricism, and we'll try to look into how did it develop over the history, and who were the first uh, proponents of empiricism. So the first empiricists in Western philosophy were the sophists, who rejected the rationalist speculation of uh, Plato and company about the world as a whole and took humanity and society to the proper objects of philosophical inquiry, invoking skeptical arguments to undermine the claims of pure reason. So, sophists are considered to be kind of a formal empiricist school of thought in history of Western philosophy, and they also they posed a challenge to those rationalists, and they invited the reaction that comprised Plato's philosophy. In fact, basically, if you remember, or Plato's philosophy was a rationalist philosophy, and he believed in the world of ideas, which we are going to discuss in detail in our next lecture. So, for the time being, we just need to look into the history of empiricism, and we need to keep it in our mind that the sophists were the first formal school of thought in a history of empiricism. Then, in medieval times, moves on to Saint Augustine and Saint Thomas Aquinas. These two medieval philosophers were great proponents of uh, empiricism. Uh, most of the medieval philosophers after St. Augustine took an empiricist position, at least about concepts, even if they recognized much substantial but non-empirical knowledge. The standard formulation of this age was, there is nothing in the intellect that was not previously in the sense perception. And then St. Thomas Aquinas in 12th and 13th century rejected the idea of innate ideas altogether. So both soul and body participate in perception for him, and all ideas are abstracted by the intellect from what is given to that by the senses. Human ideas of unseen things such as angels and demons and even God are derived by analogy from the seen. So it's not that these are the innate ideas according to St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. The concept of rasa, or tabula rasa, basically is a term which means that clean slate, a whiteboard you might call in modern times. So the concept of tabula rasa, or the clean slate, was developed by Muslim Persian philosopher Avicenna or Ibn Sina and Ibn Tufail in 11th century. uh, Ibn Sina, who further argued that knowledge is attained through empirical familiarity with objects in this world, from which one abstracts universal concepts. So it was Ibn Sina or Avicenna who floated this idea that our minds are tabula rasa, or blank slate, upon which we get all these prints from our sense experience, and then we form ideas. Uh, and these can be further developed through a syllogistic method of reasoning. So basically, foundation is provided by the sense experience to our mind, which is tabula rasa, and then these form the abstract concepts, and then these concepts can be further developed through syllogistic method of reasoning. Similarly, Ibn Tufail also demonstrated that tabula rasa as a thought experiment in which the mind of fetal child develops from a clean slate to that of an adult in complete isolation from society on a distant island through experience alone. So for him, he wrote a novel, Ibn Tufail, in which he tried to explain his theory of empiricism, and he says that even if a child is put in an island where there is no theories, nothing to form, no ideas at all, but through his experiences there, he will form the ideas, and then by analogy, because his mind is a blank slate, he will get all these ideas imprinted on his mind through the experiences he gains there. So, uh, if we look into this closely, the Muslim philosophers in medieval age has a very deep impact upon philosophy in general and in empiricism, in epistemology in particular. And this is how uh, they transferred this idea to Europe, and then the Europe developed this scientific revolution, uh, which is obviously still there, and that has given a kind of boost to Western society with the scientific revolution. So anyhow, we move on to the next one, who was called Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon was a very famous British philosopher in 16th century. Uh, Basically, uh, he's called a Renaissance philosopher, and he preferred observation to deductive reasoning as a source of knowledge. The empiricism of Franciscan nominalists was more systematic. All knowledge of what exists in nature, he held, comes from the sense, though there is, to be sure, abstractive knowledge. Uh, the empiricism of Bacon differed a bit with his predecessors, and he maintained that although there are certain abstractive knowledge or necessary truths, but essentially the knowledge is gained through sense experiences. His more extreme followers extended his line of reasoning toward radical empiricism, in which causation is not a rationally intelligible connection between events, but merely observed regularity. Francis Bacon, although did not deny the a priori knowledge, but claimed that in effect the only knowledge that is worth having as contributing to the relief of human condition is empirically based knowledge of the natural world, which should be pursued by the systematic, indeed almost mechanical arrangement of the findings of observation. And it is best undertaken in cooperative and impersonal style of modern scientific research. Bacon was in fact the first to formulate the principles of scientific induction. So basically, Francis Bacon is also considered to be the father of inductive method in logic, or induction, which is purely based upon observation and experiences. Uh, After Bacon, then comes another prominent name of Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes was a materialist and nominalist philosopher, and he combined an extreme empiricism about concepts which he saw as the outcome of material effects on bodily senses with an extreme rationalism about knowledge, of which, like Plato, he took geometry to be the paradigm. For him, all genuine knowledge is a priori a matter of rigorous deduction from definitions. The sense provides ideas, but all knowledge comes from reckoning, from deductive calculations carried out on the names that the thinker has assigned to them. Yet all knowledge also concerns material and sensible existences, since everything that exists is a body. On the other hand, many of more important claims of Thomas Hobbes in ethics and political philosophy certainly seem to be a posteriori insofar. So his philosophy is basically kind of extreme philosophy, uh, try to bring a blend of rationalism and empiricism, sorry, but his empiricism was that of a very extreme kind of empiricism in its nature. So now we move on to now we move to another important topic today's lecture, that is about British empiricism. Uh, this is the group of those British philosophers who played a vital role in the history of philosophy to establish this empiricist school of thought uh, very prominently. And the impact of that British empiricism can be still felt today. So, although there are four names in this slide, but the first three, John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume, they are considered to be the the titans of British empiricism, and who established the empiricist school of thought in modern philosophy, and that has a deep impact upon the philosophy. In the 17th and 18th century, the members of British empiricism school, John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume, were the primary exponents of empiricism. They vigorously defended empiricism against rationalism of Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza. So we start with John Locke. John Locke was an empiricist roughly in the same sense that Thomas Aquinas was, and he set the tone for the successors. His new era of ideas, as it was called, had its purpose to inquire into the original certainty and extent of human knowledge, together with the grounds and the degrees of belief, opinion, and assent. Locke wanted to assess the certainty of our knowledge as well as its extent. On the other hand, George Berkeley, he was again one of the very famous philosophers of modern times, basically being a bishop. George Berkeley's main aim was to produce a metaphysical view which would show the glory of God. Being a bishop, he wanted to glorify the God. According to his view, there is nothing which our understanding cannot grasp, and our perception can be regarded as a kind of divine language by which God speaks, and He speaks to us. For God is the cause of our perceptions. There exists, therefore, only only sensations or ideas and spirits which are their cause. God is the cause of our sensation, and we ourselves can be the cause of the ideas of the imagination. So there's a famous quote or famous slogan associated with George Berkeley, and he contended that to be is to be perceived. That basically means if something cannot be perceived, that cannot exist. So by perceived, he meant the sense perception. And in order to justify the existence of God, he came to this conclusion. After Berkeley, the name comes of that of David Hume. Hume was a distinguished philosopher, and his philosophy basically is kind of very unique philosophy, I would say. Although he was an empiricist, and he's one of the main pillars of British empiricism, but his philosophy was unique in a way that he has brought some revolutionary ideas in philosophy. Hume distinguished first between impressions and ideas. He further subdivided ideas into those of sense and those of reflection, and again into those which are simple and those which are complex. So basically, he developed a system of empiricism while differentiating between uh, impressions and ideas. He denied the existence of anything behind impressions, and a cardinal point of his empiricism, to which he returned again and again, was that every simple idea is a copy of a corresponding impression. Hume's main method in philosophy was what he called the experimental method. So David Hume is also one of the main pillars of this British empiricism. And the last but not least is J.S. Mill, or John Stuart Mill, who claimed that mathematical truths were merely very highly confirmed generalizations from our experiences. He set down as founded on induction. Thus, in Mill's philosophy, there was no real place for knowledge based on relations of ideas. In his view, logical and mathematical necessity is psychological. We are merely unable to conceive any other possibility than those which logical and mathematical propositions assert. This is perhaps the most extreme version of empiricism known, but it has not found many defenders. So, although his empiricism was quite extreme, but unfortunately, it couldn't go very long. So, this is the British empiricism in a nutshell. Uh, Now we move on to 20th century empiricism, uh, and the result of this 20th century empiricism was in the shape of pragmatism, logical positivism, and skepticism. In late 19th century and early 20th century, several forms of pragmatism arose which attempted to integrate the apparently mutually exclusive insights of empiricism, experience-based thinking, and rationalism, the concept-based thinking. So basically, pragmatism tried to reconcile both, and C.S. Peirce and William James, who coined the term radical empiricism to describe an offshoot of his form of pragmatism, were particularly important in this endeavor and in terms of pragmatism. And this pragmatism in 20th century was basically the result of empiricism and British empiricism. Another offshoot of empiricism was logical positivism. Empiricism in the 20th century have generally reverted to radical distinction between necessary truths as found in logic and mathematics and empirical truths as found elsewhere. Necessary to confine by them, however, to logic and mathematics, and all other truths are held to be merely contingent, partly for this reason and partly because it has been held that the apparatus of modern logic may be relevant to philosophical problems. 20th century empiricists have expanded to call themselves logical empiricists. Logical positivism, basically, as we have discussed elsewhere in our one of the lectures, uh, that was a school of thought, a kind of a very extreme position, and they contended there are only two kind of meaningful statements, the analytic and synthetic. So analytic statements are those statements which are true by their virtue of their very existence, like when we say all bachelors are unmarried. So the predicate already exists in its premise, uh, in antecedent. And the other kind of meaningful statements for logical positivists were synthetic, which can be proven through experience. So these two, without apart from these two kind of statements for them, everything else was meaningless. So they discarded basically metaphysical and religious statements as meaningless statements. Another offshoot of empiricism was skepticism, which basically was propounded by David Hume. David Hume brought to this empiricist viewpoint an extreme skepticism. He argued all of human knowledge can be divided into two categories: relations of ideas, that is, propositions involving some contingent observation of the world, such as the sun rises in the east, and matter of fact, mathematical and logical propositions, and that ideas derived from our impressions or sensations. In the face of this, he argued that even the most basic beliefs about natural world or even in the existence of self cannot be conclusively established by reason, but we accept them anyway because of their basis in instinct and custom. So basically, his stance was that there is no necessary connection between cause and effect. There's only constant conjunctions. So it's mere our experience which tells us that when there is a cause, it must have an effect. It is not a kind of necessary connection, but a constant conjunction. And this was also the offshoot of this radical empiricism in terms, in shape of skepticism. So this is empiricism for you, and these are the references. Uh, I would recommend you to have a look into these two couple of websites and these two books for further readings. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask me. You can use the WhatsApp, or you can ask me the questions through KCMS. Till next lecture, take good care of yourself and your loved ones, and I will see you in the next lecture. Thank you very much, and Allah Hafiz.